My daughter, Dolores Barrymore, put on her good shoes that morning and sat by the window to wait. She was 3 years old. She had dressed herself. She had done her buttons herself. She believed her father, John Barrymore, the most celebrated actor in America, was coming to take her to see the eagle he kept in the yard. He was in his study with the curtains drawn. He had been in there since the night before. I watched her sit at that window for 2 hours. I did not tell John Barrymore that his daughter was waiting. I told myself he would come on his own when he was ready. He did not come. He was never ready. Not that day. Not on most of the days that followed. What happened to Dolores Barrymore, to my Dee Dee, did not look like destruction from the outside. It looked like a quiet childhood, a quiet disappearance, a quiet life. But I was inside it, and there is one thing I saw that I have never told anyone. Not until now. Dee Dee Barrymore never got to tell her own story. If you think she deserved to be heard, type her name in the comments. Just Dolores. Let her name exist somewhere it was never supposed to. Subscribe to Old Money Widows. Let me tell you who Dolores Barrymore was before the silence set in. She was born on the 8th of April, 1930, in Los Angeles. She was named after me. Dolores Costello, the woman they had called the goddess of the silent screen, though by the time my daughter arrived, the screen and I were already separating. I retired from acting in 1931. She was my reason, and I did not regret it. I want you to understand that before anything else, I chose her. Her father was John Barrymore. If you do not know that name, here is what you need to know. He was considered the greatest stage actor of his generation. Hamlet, Richard III. He could fill a theatre on his name alone, and when he turned his face a certain way, they called him the Great Profile for a reason. The entire audience forgot to breathe. He had signed contracts with Warner Brothers in the 1920s for $150,000 per picture. He was magnetic, brilliant, and constitutionally incapable of being still. He was also an alcoholic. He had been one since before I met him. I knew it when I married him in 1928, which tells you something about what charm of that magnitude can do to a woman's better judgment. But Dee Dee, she was nothing like him. That was the first surprise. I had expected a Barrymore, loud, theatrical, born already performing. Instead, I got a child who preferred to watch. She had my colouring, pale and almost silvery, and even as a toddler, she wore an expression that made you feel she had already heard something you hadn't. She laughed easily and quietly. She dressed herself with great seriousness from an early age, particular about buttons, about collars, about whether her shoes were right for the occasion. I thought it was vanity at first. It was not vanity. It was preparation, as though she understood, even then, that the world she lived inside could change without warning, and she wanted to be ready when it did. When she was 2 years old, barely two, I found her standing in the hallway outside the sitting room where John was holding court with his usual crowd, actors, writers, admirers. The room was loud. John was the loudest thing in it. And there was my daughter, standing in the hallway, not trying to get in, just listening, already working out the geometry of him from a safe distance. I thought at the time that she was shy. I understand now that she was already learning. The morning with the good shoes was not the first time he had failed to appear, but it was the first time I fully understood what his absences were doing. She waited at that window for 2 hours in her best dress, with her buttons done wrong. She had done them herself and gotten one off. And I had not corrected it because she had been so proud. And when I finally told her that her father wasn't feeling well today, she looked at me with those pale, quiet eyes and said, "He forgot, didn't he, Mama?" 3 years old. Not a question. She had already learned how to make his failures small enough to carry. I took her outside to look at the eagle in the yard, the bald eagle that John kept in a cage. because with John even a pet had to be a statement, and I told myself she would not remember this, that children forgot things, that we would have another day. I was wrong off all three counts. She remembered everything. What no one ever wrote about Dolores Barrymore, what never made it into any account of the Barrymore family, because she was the quiet one, the one who didn't drink and didn't perform and didn't end up as a cautionary tale, was that she spent her entire childhood doing an extraordinary thing. She was building a private self that her father's chaos could not touch. The cost of that construction was something she paid quietly, alone, for the rest of her life. What I could not see then, what I only understood much later, was that she wasn't just surviving him. She was disappearing. Not yet, not all at once, but it had already started. John Barrymore was not a villain. I need to say that clearly, because villain is too simple and simplicity is too kind to what he actually was. He was something harder to protect against, a man of extraordinary gifts who had been raised in an extraordinary family and had never once been asked to show up consistently for anyone. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was 11. His father was an actor, absent, erratic, and John and his siblings Ethel and Lionel were raised by their grandmother, the formidable Louisa Lane Drew, whose formidability was directed entirely toward the stage, not toward children, not toward the particular work of being daily, reliable, present. John grew up knowing how to hold an audience. He did not know how to hold a child's attention across an ordinary afternoon without a performance attached. He had already proven this with Diana. Diana Barrymore was his daughter from his second marriage to the poet and playwright Blanche Ulrichs. He left that marriage when Diana was 4 years old. She barely saw him afterward. By the time she was a teenager, she had built an entire mythology around a father she did not know, and when she finally found him, the man did not match the myth. Diana drank herself to death at 38. The memoir she wrote was called Too Much, Too Soon. The title was accurate. I watched Diana and I told myself, Dee Dee is different. I am different. We divorced in 1935, but I managed the custody carefully. I made arrangements. I created routines. I believed that structure could absorb what he could not provide. What I had not accounted for was his charm. After long absences, weeks, sometimes months, John would arrive with the full force of himself. There was an afternoon, sometime in 1936, when he appeared at the door unexpectedly and took both children into the yard and sat on the grass in his good suit. The suit was already too large for him by then, but he wore it beautifully, and he told them the story of playing Hamlet in New York, doing all the voices himself, the ghost, the king, Ophelia, making Dee Dee laugh until she couldn't breathe. For 2 hours he was entirely present, not performing for an audience, present for her. I stood at the kitchen window and watched it, and felt something I can only describe as grief for a version of him that was still possible, just not reliable. He remembered specific things about her on those days. The colour of a dress she had worn 3 months before, a joke she had made about the eagle, the name she had given, a stray cat that had appeared in the garden and then disappeared. He carried those details the way a magician carries coins, producing them at exactly the right moment to make you forget everything else. The children forgot. I almost forgot. And then I would watch Dee Dee's face during those visits. The way it opened, the way she became briefly, visibly, the child she would have been if he had always been like this. Unguarded, unprotected, reaching toward him with both hands. That face was the most dangerous thing I ever saw, because I knew what came after it. He would leave again. The drinking would close over him again. The promises made during the good days would dissolve as though they had never been spoken. and Dee Dee would be left holding the version of her father that only existed sometimes, trying to understand why that version kept disappearing. The moment I most wanted to intervene, the moment I almost said something I should have said years earlier, was a visit in 1937. She was 7. John had arrived in rare form, charming, present, doing voices, telling stories. She was laughing in a way she almost never laughed, uncontrolled, unguarded. And I stood in the doorway watching, and I thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water, she is falling in love with him all over again, and he is going to leave in 2 hours, and she is not going to understand why her chest hurts. Afterward, I close the door. I tell myself I did it, because interrupting would have cost her even that. Maybe that was true. Maybe I was simply a coward about what I would have had to say. What I didn't do was warn her. And what happened next is something I have never told anyone. It was 1936. Dee Dee was 6 years old. I had brought the children to see him. John Drew, her younger brother, was 4. And while John Drew went inside with the nurse, Dee Dee stayed on the front steps of the Tower Road house. She didn't know I was watching from the car. John Barrymore came to the door. He was not what you would call drunk. He had achieved by 1936 the particular equilibrium that serious alcoholics can maintain, enough to stabilize, not enough to tip. He looked, standing in the doorway in the afternoon light, something like the man I had married, something like a father. She looked up at him. He looked at her, and then past her to the garden, to the view, to something in the middle distance that held his attention more completely than a 6-year-old girl on his front steps. His face ran through several expressions quickly and settled on warmth. He had performed warmth so many times that it had become fluent. Even to himself, I think. He said something. She laughed. Then he went back inside. She sat on those steps alone for several minutes. She did not cry. She did not look for me. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the door he had closed. And her face was, I have tried to find the word for that expression across many years, and the closest I can get is prepared. She looked prepared, like someone who had already rehearsed what came next and was simply waiting for her cue. She was 6 years old. She stood up. She straightened her collar with 2 fingers, a gesture so precise, so deliberate that it stopped my breath, and she walked toward me, and she said, Daddy says he might take us to see a picture next week. She said it carefully. The way you carry something fragile across a room. I said that sounded lovely. This is the part where I have to be careful with what I say. I knew he would not take her to see a picture the following week. He had said the same thing, in different arrangements, more times than I could count. What I wanted to say was, stop building on what he promises. The foundation keeps moving. I have been watching it move for 8 years, and I need you to know that it is not your fault when it shifts again, I said. That sounds lovely. When I got back in the car that afternoon, I sat for a long time before starting the engine. She was 6 years old, and she was already doing the work of carrying his failures as though they were somehow hers to manage, as though the problem were her patience rather than his absence. She was not old enough to name what was happening to her. She simply lived inside it, straightened her collar, and waited for the following week. He did not take her to see a picture the following week. She did not mention it again. That was the thing about Dee Dee, the thing that broke my heart in a different way than Diana's destruction ever did. Diana Barrymore's pain was visible. It announced itself. It drank and raged and published itself in a memoir and died at 38 in an apartment in New York. Her suffering had an audience. Dee Dee's suffering had no audience at all. She simply got quieter, more composed, more careful with her dress, more measured with her words, more precise about where she placed her hope. I watched it happen from a distance I could not close, And the worst of it, the part I have carried longest, is that she never once asked me to explain him. She never cried and demanded to know why he forgot, why he left, why he looked past her. She had already answered that question for herself, and whatever answer she arrived at, she kept it. She never said it aloud. Not to me. Not once. That silence between us, her silence about him and mine, is the thing I have carried longest. It is heavier than anything he ever did. By 1938, John Barrymore was in the newspapers every week for reasons that had nothing to do with his talent. His fourth marriage, to Elaine Barry, a woman 22 years younger than himself, was unraveling publicly. His debts were accumulating in ways that were no longer possible to conceal. He had been contracted to Warner Brothers in the 1920s at $150,000 per picture. That money was gone. All of it. And then, more than all of it, the Tower Road property that had once housed an eagle in a cage and the remnants of a great career was being stripped by creditors piece by piece. His memory was failing. He had begun reading his lines from cue cards. At 60 years old, the man who had played Hamlet from memory on Broadway, who had been called the greatest classical actor in America, was reading his lines from cue, cards on radio programs, because he could not hold them in his mind. Dee Dee was 8 years old, and the other girls at school were talking. She came home one afternoon. She had been at a friend's house, and she went directly to her room without speaking. I found her there 20 minutes later, sitting on the edge of her bed, still in her coat. That detail has always stayed with me. She had not taken off her coat, as though she were not certain she was safe enough to stay. I asked her what had happened. She said the other girls had been talking about her father. She didn't say what they had said. She didn't need to. I could see the shape of it in how she was sitting, perfectly still, perfectly composed. The stillness of a child who has decided that movement costs something she isn't willing to spend. I sat down next to her. She said, "Is it going to get worse?" I told her I didn't know. It got worse. The following year, 1939, John came for a visit. He was supposed to take the children for the afternoon. He arrived, and I want to be precise here, because precision matters. He arrived in the state he had developed by then, as a kind of alternative sobriety, not falling down drunk. The dangerous kind, controlled, warm, perfectly fluent. The kind you could miss if you weren't watching for it. Dee Dee saw it the moment he walked through the door. I watched her see it. Something went through her face. Fast, practiced, already automatic by 9 years old. And then she smiled at him. She asked him a question. She kept the conversation moving. She laughed at something he said and steered the next moment and the moment after that. And she never once asked him directly if he had been drinking. She was protecting him. 9 years old, and she was protecting him. I stood in the hallway and watched my daughter manage her father with a skill that should not have existed in a child that age. She had developed, without anyone teaching her, without anyone naming what she was doing, a complete set of strategies for keeping him comfortable in his own failures. She asked the right questions. She kept his attention moving before it could settle on anything difficult. She performed delight. She was 9 years old, and she had already learned that her father needed an audience more than he needed a daughter. I did not intervene. The honest reason is not that I feared a scene. It's that I did not know what to do with a child who had outpaced me. She had already solved the problem I had been trying to solve for years. The solution was manage him, contain him, give him what he needed to stay pleasant. That she was 9 years old and doing it alone. That was the thing I did not know how to address. The moment I understood how far it had gone was that same afternoon, after John left. She came to the kitchen where I was. She poured herself a glass of water. She stood at the counter drinking it, looking out the window, and she said, Not to me, not quite to herself, somewhere in the space between "he's having a hard time." That was all. She said it without bitterness, without anger. She said it with the particular gentle authority of a child who had decided that her father's condition was something to be explained and accommodated rather than grieved. I didn't say anything. I should have said, "You are not responsible for explaining him. You are 9 years old, and he is his own explanation." What I said was nothing. That silence is one I still live in. John's decline after 1939 was rapid. His career had reduced itself to radio spots and cameo appearances designed to exploit his own disintegration. Directors cast him to play versions of a ruined great man because that required no performance, only presence. His hands shook. He lost weight. The house on Tower Road was gone. The collections were gone. What remained of John Barrymore by 1941 was a famous name attached to a body that was surrendering. He collapsed on the radio stage on May 19, 1942. He was taken to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. The official cause of death, cirrhosis, kidney failure, pneumonia, arrived in the papers before anyone thought to tell me privately. That was how it was with John, even at the end. The public got the announcement. Everyone else got the aftershock. He died on May 29, 1942. He was 60 years old, the great profile. The man who had played Hamlet from memory before 1,000 people, who had made Dolores Costello faint during a kissing scene on a film set in 1926, who had earned $150, Zeozozen per picture and spent every last dollar of it and borrowed more. Dead in a hospital room, his body finally done with the war he had waged against it for 40 years. Dee Dee was 12. John Drew was 10. What John Barrymore left his children was not money. There was none. Not property. It had been consumed. Not even, finally, the hope that he might become the father he had occasionally resembled on good days. He left them a name. The name Barrymore in 1942 still meant something significant in the world. It meant theatre, royalty, talent, legend. It also meant, to anyone paying attention, a particular pattern. Brilliance and wreckage, repeating. His daughter Diana was already in the early stages of following it. His son John Drew would follow it too. The drinking, the erratic behaviour, the 4 marriages, the slow professional collapse, the eventual death in 2004. Dee Dee did not follow it. And that choice, quiet, private, made without announcement, is the most interesting thing about her. It is the thing that almost no one has noticed, because the Barrymores who disappeared into ordinary lives left very little behind to be noticed. Her half-sister Diana published a memoir. It became a film. It is still discussed. Dee Dee married a man named Thomas Fairbanks in 1950. She was 19. She had a daughter named Hilary. By 1951, there is a photograph of her at 21, holding her infant daughter, with her Aunt Ethel beside her. The caption calls her the newest member of the Barrymore acting clan, though she never acted at all. Someone had already written her a story before she was done living it. She moved away from Hollywood. She became someone no one was watching. What I have thought about for 50 years is whether that was a wound or a victory. I have not always known which answer to give. I know what answer I want to give. I need to account for myself clearly. I was not the one who suffered most in this story. That matters. It means I have no right to cast myself as a victim of it, and I am not going to. Here is what I tried. After the divorce in 1935, I built our life on consistency, the same table, the same hours. A house that felt like a house rather than a stage set that could be struck overnight. It was partly for the children, and partly because I had spent 7 years where the only constant was John Barrymore's appetite. For admiration, for drink, for the next thing, always the next thing, and I was so tired of that appetite that I built an entire life in opposition to it. Small, predictable, safe, regular meals, regular school, the same faces at the door. Dee Dee understood what I was doing, I think. She never said so. But she was careful with the routines in the way that people are careful with things they know are holding them together. I tried to negotiate with him, not about money, about time, about showing up when he said he would, about calling if he was not coming. These seem like small requests. They were. He could not reliably meet them. My sister Helene told me in 1938 to stop the visits entirely. Helene, who had her own difficult marriage and was watching her own life come apart. She had married the director Lowell Sherman, and when he died, and her subsequent marriages failed, her own struggles with drinking increased. But she was clear on this point. "Stop the visits," she said. "Tell him he cannot come to the house at all." I told her I had already tried that. I had warned him in 1940 that if he arrived drunk again, I would not open the door. He looked at me with those eyes. Even at 58, even ruined, he still had those extraordinary eyes, and he said I was being cruel. And I stood there and I thought, am I? That question is the wall I hit every time. Not John's anger, not the court arrangements, which gave me custody and gave him visits and gave me very little recourse when those visits went wrong. The wall was John Barrymore's ability to make his failures feel like other people's failures. He was so fluent in the language of being wronged that I could not always distinguish his genuine feeling from his performance. And I had been watching him perform for 15 years. The one thing I never tried, and this is the thing I have least forgiveness for myself about, is telling Dee Dee what I saw, not the harshest version. I understand that a child cannot hold the harshest version of her own father, but some version true enough to release her from the responsibility she had taken on. Something that said, "You are carrying something that is not yours." What I said instead, across 12 years, was, "Your father loves you in his way." That phrase, "in his way," means the way he is capable of. The way that doesn't always look like love from where you're standing, but is the closest he can get. The way that will leave you on the front steps looking at a closed door. And I know that, and I cannot stop it, and I am sorry. That is what in his way means. I never said any of that aloud. I gave her the shorthand and kept the translation for myself. The real answer to why I didn't intervene more decisively is not complicated. It is simply this. Dee Dee loved him. Whatever he was and whatever he failed to give her, she loved him. That love was visible in her face every time he walked through a door. And I was not willing to be the person who stood between a child and the father she loved, even knowing what I knew. I thought love was something I was obligated to protect. I was wrong. The love was fine. The love was going to survive regardless. What I should have protected was her understanding of what she was actually receiving, which was not love in full, but love in the particular, diminished form that was all John Barrymore had ever been able to offer anyone. She deserved to know the difference. I couldn't find the courage to give it to her. He died on May 29, 1942, and I was not there. I was not supposed to be there. We had been divorced for 7 years. He had married and destroyed a fourth marriage in the years between. I had my own life, a remarriage that was quiet and ultimately unsuccessful, to a physician named John Vruwink, whose steadiness I had sought and whose steadiness could not compensate for what I had already lost. What I knew. He collapsed on a radio stage in May. He was taken to Hollywood Presbyterian. He died of cirrhosis, kidney failure, and pneumonia. 60 years old. The great profile, the greatest classical actor of his generation. Gone in a hospital with a body that had been at war with itself for decades and finally lost. His estate was essentially zero. The debts were everything. The Tower Road house had already been sold. The art, the collections, the eagle in its cage, All of it was gone. His children received the name. Dee Dee was 12. She came to me the day I told her. She sat down in the chair across from mine, the same way she had been sitting since she was 3 years old. Hands in her lap, perfectly still, that composure that had always looked like strength, and that I now understood was something she had built, stone by stone, against him. She said, "Was he alone?" I told her I thought he had not been entirely alone. That was not entirely true. She probably knew it. She said, "Good." And that was all. 2 words, no tears, no questions. She sat for another moment and then she stood and she left the room. I want to go back to the photograph now. The one from 1934, John standing, holding little John Drew on his shoulder, and me seated with Dee Dee on my lap. She is 4 years old. She is looking up at her father. I told you in the beginning that I could not describe the expression on her face. I said it was wonder. I said it was something close to love, but not quite. I was not being precise enough. What I can see now, looking back at the memory of that photograph, is hunger. She was 4 years old, and she was hungry for something her father had and could not give. Not love. She had enough love in her life from me, from the ordinary dailiness of our home. What she was hungry for was a specific thing that only he could provide. The experience of being fully seen by the most visible man in any room. She could feel the possibility of it on good days. She could see the edge of what it would be like to have his complete attention. And that glimpse was, in some ways, more damaging than if he had simply been absent. The partial view of the thing made it impossible to stop wanting the rest. He never gave it to her. Not fully. Not in the way she needed. That is what she was looking at in the photograph. That is what she sat on the front steps waiting for, at 6 years old, hands in her lap. That is what she said good about, at 12, when I told her he had died. Because she was not glad he was gone. She was glad that the waiting was over. That the particular hope she had been carrying, against all available evidence, for as long as she could remember, had been given a definite end. You cannot keep waiting for someone who is dead. She understood, at 12, that his death was the only version of resolution she was ever going to receive. She smoothed her dress. She left the room. In 1950, she married Thomas Fairbanks. She was 19. She moved away from Los Angeles, away from the name, away from the industry that had built and dismantled her family across 3 generations. She had a daughter named Hillary. She built a life that looked, from the outside, like someone had simply stepped off the stage. Records suggest that, as of 2019, Dolores Ethel Barrymore was still alive. She would be in her late 80s. She chose ordinary days, and she is still in them. The hardest thing about watching someone disappear quietly is that there is no moment to point to, no collapse, no memoir, no 38-year-old body found in a New York apartment. Diana Barrymore's story is a tragedy with a shape. You can trace it. Beginning, descent, end. Dolores Barrymore's story has no shape like that. It has a beginning. Those good shoes, those buttons done wrong. And then a long middle. And then simply a different life. One where the name Barrymore was something she folded up and put away. What I never forgot, the buttons. She had done them wrong, and I had not corrected them because she was so proud. The way she said, "He forgot, didn't he?" Mama at 3 years old, not a question. The door closing after his face had gone through those expressions and settled on warmth. Her voice at 12 was, he alone, good, quiet as a door latch. What I wish I had said. He loves you and he cannot reach you. Those are not contradictions. They can be true simultaneously, and neither of them is your fault. I never said it that clearly. I said approximations. I protected myself from the difficulty of saying it plainly, and I left her to carry the unspoken version alone. She was not a fragile child. She did not need protection from the truth. What she needed was someone to name what she was already living, so she could stop managing it in secret. I did not give her that. I gave her structure and routine and quiet and love, and those were real and genuinely meant, and they were not the whole of what she needed. Here is what I want people to understand about John Barrymore's effect on his daughter, Dolores. He did not destroy her. That is the first thing, and it is important. She did not break the way Diana broke. She did not follow the pattern. She found an exit from it that no one else in the Barrymore family had managed to find, which was simply leave, quietly, without a statement, without a memoir or a performance or a public grief. But the damage was real. She bent herself into a particular shape to survive him. She developed, before she was 10 years old, skills she should never have needed. Skills for managing an unpredictable adult, for absorbing disappointment without reaction, for smoothing over the cracks in someone else's foundation. Those skills served her. They also cost her something I cannot calculate, because I only saw part of it. I asked her once, when she was an adult and her own children were grown, what she remembered about her father. She thought about it for a long time. She said she remembered his voice. She said she remembered the way the light changed in a room when he walked into it. She did not say, I remember the waiting. She did not say, I remember learning at 9 years old how to protect a grown man from himself. She did not say, I remember sitting on the steps, looking at the door he had closed. She remembered his voice and the light. I have thought about that for many years. I think it was her gift to herself, the act of keeping only the version of him that was beautiful and letting the rest go. She had earned that right. She had paid for it. There is a particular kind of damage that brilliant, ruinous fathers do to daughters that almost never gets written down. It has no crisis point, no clear before and after. It accumulates in small rooms. A window, a pair of good shoes, a collar straightened with 2 fingers. It accumulates in the space between what a father promises and what he actually gives across 12 years, across 1,000 ordinary days that a child had to learn to fill by herself. It doesn't leave marks you can photograph or name in an official record. It leaves a shape. The shape of a person who learned very early that loving someone dangerous means developing a skill set no child should have. And the cruelest thing about that skill set is that it works. It kept her functional. It kept her composed. It kept her from breaking the way the other Barrymores broke. And so, from the outside, it looked like she was fine. Dolores Barrymore survived John Barrymore. That is the full sentence. That is the whole story. She deserved a father who came when he said he would. She deserved a childhood where she didn't have to dress herself and wait at a window and decide, at 3 years old, how to make someone else's absence into something she could live inside. She deserved to grow up belonging entirely to herself. She chose to give her daughter that. Whatever it cost her, she gave her daughter that. And if she is still out there, in her ordinary days, in her quiet rooms, far from the name that tried to define her before she had the chance to define herself, I hope she knows this. Ordinary days are the most radical thing a Barrymore ever managed. Every other member of that family gave the world a performance. She gave herself a life. She deserved every single day of it. She was always worth it.